Welcome back to What Your GP Doesn't Tell You, the podcast for both doctors and patients, with me, Liz Tucker. Most of the time in this podcast, I talk to doctors, researchers, and sometimes investigative journalists. But in this week's episode, I'm talking to Laura Delano, who, diagnosed as bipolar when she was a teenager, went on to spend 13 years receiving ever more intensive psychiatric care. I wanted to chat to Laura because her story is both extraordinary and, I think, really important to hear. As she explains in her new book, Unshrunk, how the mental health industry took over my life and my fight to get it back. Published by Monoray. After her initial bipolar diagnosis, Laura gradually accumulated more and more diagnoses, and along with those came more and more drugs. But there was a problem. Laura wasn't getting better. And despite being a high-achieving student for whom it had once appeared a glittering future awaited, her life had fallen apart. She dropped out of university, was unable to hold down a full-time job, and had tried to kill herself. Then one day, Laura wondered if actually, rather than the psychiatric care and drugs helping her, was it possible that they might be causing her problems? The medical professionals she discussed this with were deeply sceptical, believing she badly needed the support of her drugs. But Laura was determined. Gradually, she weaned herself off all her drugs. No easy process. But the impact was transformative, and Laura completely turned her life around. So just how did it happen that a bright, articulate woman with so much to offer could find her life derailed for so long? What went wrong? And why was the medical system unable to recognise what was happening to Laura? But before we get to our interview, a brief request from me. If you enjoy this podcast and would like to leave a review on Spotify or Apple, that would be much appreciated. It really helps. You can also become a paid supporter of the podcast at patreon.com/whatyourgpdoesn'ttellyu or via PayPal on my website, whatyourgpdoesn'ttellyu.com. A huge amount of work goes into both the research and production of this podcast, so even a small amount of money makes a huge difference. And you can find out more information about the pod on my website, where you can sign up for the podcast mailing list, follow me on Twitter at Liz C. Tucker, and on my Substack account, liz.tucker.substack.com. Many thanks. Now back to Laura's interview. Laura Delano is a writer, speaker, and consultant. She's the founder of the Inner Compass Initiative, a non-profit organisation that she says helps people make more informed choices about psychiatric diagnoses, drugs, and drug withdrawal. Here's Laura's interview. Well, Laura, welcome to the podcast today.
Thanks, Liz. It's great to be here.
So, Laura, to anyone looking from the outside at your life at age 13, they'd think you had everything. You're a successful, sporty, academic, popular girl, loving parents. And then one day, you're standing in front of a mirror and you have this terrifying experience. Can you explain what happened?
Sure. So, as you said, I'd grown up performing well. I was the kind of kid who could study and regurgitate information and get good grades and play sports well. And so my whole sense of self had been wrapped up in that. It had been tied to how well I did in my life. And that night in the mirror that you mentioned that I start my book with, I ended up having this incredibly overwhelming out-of-body experience where I lost touch with me. And I saw this strange girl looking at me in the mirror, and I realized, I don't know who she is. Who is this stranger in front of me? And the young girl that I was, I had no framework to make sense of what that realization might mean. So I concluded I'm just a fake robot, basically programmed to perform. And this was a realization that I didn't tell anyone. It felt too scary and confusing to try to explain to anyone, so I just kept it to myself. But of course, I didn't know how to extricate myself from this performance game that I now saw I was part of, so I just compartmentalized it and tried to pretend it hadn't happened.
And do you think this episode in front of the mirror, although in the book it's a trigger, but I wonder if it was actually the sort of final straw that various other events had been leading up to?
I think it's possible. It was precipitated, I think, probably by the fact that I had been elected the president of my middle school, and I was meant to be on stage the next day leading an assembly. And so that might have been the final straw, you could say, where I was going to literally be looked to by all of these classmates as the role model, as the girl who'd been given this power to lead. That might have been what pushed me over the edge. And who's to say if I hadn't been leading an assembly the next day, if I'd have had that experience. But I do think it was probably inevitable that at some point my sense of self would collapse given this intense, perfectionistic, high expectation environment that I grew up in.
And at what stage had you started cutting yourself?
It was after that mirror experience that I eventually began needing to turn to something to release all of this trapped anger and fear that I had inside of me. So it was around 13 into 14.
Can you explain, because someone who has never done anything like that, it seems such a puzzling thing to do.
Indeed. And I think especially young people and girls especially turn to self-injury for all different kinds of reasons. When I look back on my relationship to it over the many years that I did it, it played two different roles for me. The first role, when I first began doing it, was that I had so much trapped emotion inside of me and I didn't know how to get it out. And so it was almost as though by cutting myself, I could release this trapped pain in me. But at other times, especially later on, when I was kind of well into my psychiatric patient career, self-injury was a way to feel something because I felt just so disconnected, and intentionally exerting pain on myself felt like a way to feel.
So you almost felt like, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it's almost like a sort of out-of-body experience, and cutting yourself brings you back to a moment of reality, even if it's painful.
It's a good way to put it. Whether it's cutting or burning or disordered eating, which I had a long relationship with as well, I do think the body can become, especially for girls, the body can become this object that you feel like you can exert power over when you feel powerless in your life, when you feel out of control. Here is something you can exert control over. And so I think that was definitely at the heart of my long relationship with self-injury.
It was interesting because when I was reading your book, it slightly reminded me of a book written by the journalist Hadley Freeman, who wrote a book about her experiences about anorexia, who I had in a podcast. And traditionally, the view of particularly anorexic girls has been high-performing perfectionists. And I was reminded of that when I was thinking about your background.
Indeed. And certainly my years of what would have probably been diagnosed anorexia or exercise bulimia would fit that description very well. It was primed to conquer the arenas of my life that I felt were my fate, basically. And so once, there was the school, there was the classroom, there was the athletic court, and then eventually I realized there's my body too. And I can conquer this body and get it under my control and kind of hone away at it until it's quote unquote perfect, which of course it never is. So I know I'm aware of Freeman's work and I haven't actually read her book, but that resonates a lot with me, how you describe it.
I recommend it. I think you'd find it really interesting. So it's clear to your parents, like a lot of teenagers, that you're pretty angst-driven. So initially they suggest that you see a therapist. And she doesn't put you on any drugs.
No, we just talked.
But she feels then that you need further psychiatric help. So it's when you see a psychiatrist for the first time that things start to change.
Yep. In my first appointment with a psychiatrist to whom I'd been referred by that therapist, within an hour, my life was different. I left that first appointment with this story that I had this incurable mental illness called bipolar disorder, and I'd been given prescriptions for Depakote, which to this day is still not approved for psychiatric use in children. It's classed as a mood stabilizer, and Prozac, which had not at the time been approved for use in children. And just in the snap of a finger, this psychiatrist said, all of these intense emotional experiences that you're having, the anger, the rage, the acting out, the despair, the cutting, the thoughts of death, these are all signs of this lifelong condition called bipolar. But don't worry, they're medications. So that definitely set me on a different path in an instant.
To begin with, you really fight against the diagnosis of bipolar disorder. It's only later that you come to believe it.
Yep. I knew in my gut that there was not something wrong with me here, that my emotions were meaningful responses to this very high-pressured all-girls private school that I was going to, and the kind of broader culture of my town, which was this affluent New England town where everything looked perfect on the surface. I knew that these emotional experiences I was having were responses to all of that. And so I did do my best to deny what the psychiatrist had told me. And I managed to avoid taking the medications quite a bit through high school, in part because I ended up going away to boarding school and I just put my pills in a drawer and didn't take them at all for a time.
Well, I wondered about that because initially you're taking them and not taking. I'm sure we'll get on to talk about this a bit further. But, the effects of drug withdrawal can do very strange things to the body. And so I just wondered early on, if you were taking the drugs on some days, not taking them on another, if even then you could have been affected by drug withdrawal.
It's possible. I don't know if I was ever taking them consistently enough over many weeks or months to have developed dependence, but it's completely possible, or having some kind of adverse effect from stopping and starting.
It obviously depends on people's biology, but I think some people, even a few days, it's potentially possible.
Yep, it's totally possible that was happening.
Your academic career continues and you're still academically incredibly successful. You go to Harvard early and you finally, I think, start to think, yes, I do have bipolar disease.
Yes, once I got to Harvard, everything fell apart very fast, in part because I had been desperately hoping that this realization I'd had about the absurdity and the meaninglessness to the performance game was wrong, and that I would finally actually feel okay once I got to Harvard, and I could prove myself wrong, and then everything would be well, and I'd be happy and at peace. And I could just pretend it all didn't happen. And of course, that didn't happen. So when I got there and nothing felt different, I felt so desperately terrified by this because there was nothing else I could look forward to in the future to kind of fix me. Harvard hadn't fixed me. And so I really spun out, and I wasn't sleeping much, and I was drinking and doing drugs and getting into all kinds of trouble, and I was skipping classes, and my grades dropped, and I was chronically sick because I wasn't taking care of myself. By the winter of that first year of college, I was in so much pain, and I was so overwhelmed by hopelessness that I concluded, that psychiatrist must have been right, because there's no reason why I should feel this way. Why do I want to die? Why can't I function? And that desperation, I think, drove me back to psychiatry, and I never looked back from that moment on.
And when you say you were taking drugs, you mean non-prescription drugs like ecstasy and cocaine?
Yep, alcohol and illicit drugs, so to speak. And then the medications re-entered the scene that winter.
And so now you're taking the mood stabilizer, Depakote, and now a new antipsychotic, Seroquel. But you meet a new psychiatrist who actually thinks you're not bipolar, but he comes up with a new diagnosis.
Interestingly enough, that psychiatrist I began seeing that winter, I don't recall him telling me he wasn't sure I was bipolar. I left our first appointment feeling that diagnosis had been confirmed. And I only realized this many years later when I got my records, that he had actually said, rule out bipolar disorder is not certain, possibly borderline personality disorder. But I don't recall being told that. What I recall is that he confirmed what that psychiatrist had told me years earlier. And so I just left feeling totally convinced that I was bipolar. The borderline label, which did follow me through much of my patient career.
This is borderline personality disorder.
Yes. I was often not even told that was in my records. And it wasn't until later on that was explicitly given to me as a diagnosis. And I don't think I'm the only young woman who's had that experience.
Well, yes, you mentioned in the book that women are far more likely to be diagnosed with borderline personality disorder than men.
Yes. And if you look at the criteria for the diagnosis, it's hard not to interpret it as a way to box in difficult women who you're finding as the clinician kind of unpleasant to deal with.
You touched on burning at the start of our conversation. Actually, one of the most disturbing stories I found in the book is when you ask someone to stub out a cigarette in your arm.
Well, that poor young man was definitely intoxicated. I highly doubt he would have gone along with it if he wasn't. By that point, well, I'll back up for a minute. I don't actually include this in the book. I did at one point. I took it out. But from young childhood, I'd always had this interesting relationship to physical pain. I would experiment on myself when I was little with putting my hands under scalding water and staring into the mirror until the sensation stopped hurting. For whatever reason, as a young child, I found what I thought was a discovery that, you can transcend physical pain. And so that freshman year when I really spun out at Harvard and was out that night drinking and doing drugs with these hockey players, basically made this giant hockey player put a cigarette out on me. I could access that basically dissociative state at the ready. I could kind of go there whenever I wanted by that point. And it was what helped me feel like I had power and control over myself was by transcending pain. And so the poor guy went along with it. And I think he was probably pretty traumatized by it. But I felt so powerful. I think it speaks really to just how desperate and overwhelmed and disoriented I was in my life, that it took that for me to feel like I have a grip on my life.
Yeah. I mean, you say you made him, but he's a big hockey player. He may have been drunk, but I still find it quite difficult that he went along with that.
Fair point.
So you've gone back on your prescription drugs, but I think at this point, your story also illustrates how one drug can cause a side effect. So you then take another drug to counteract that because your prescriptions are causing insomnia. So you take the sleeping drug Ambien to deal with that. We can debate how effective Ambien is as a sleeping drug, but that's a separate issue. And that then causes some daytime sleepiness. So then you're prescribed Provigal, which is an anti-narcoleptic.
Yes, and people always get a kick out of that when I explain the regimen that I was on at the same time. People say, "Wait, what? I'm sorry, you had an insomnia drug at night and an anti-narcoleptic drug during the day?" But I don't think I'm the only one who ends up on the polypharmacy regimen that's basically just various different drug classes that all counteract one another. And to me at the time, I remember feeling really taken care of because these pills came to symbolize my pain being seen and validated and recognized and addressed. And so the more meds, the more my doctors were prioritizing my care. And so I didn't see any problem with it. To be perfectly honest, I thought it was a sign that I was getting really good care.
Well, I can understand that. I remember when I interviewed Dr. Mark Horowitz, who's written a really good guide about drug withdrawal. If anybody would like to listen to that podcast, he's on 5 psychiatric drugs. And I said, that sounds an awful lot. And he said, oh, but it didn't to me. So given he was a doctor, I therefore can understand how people who are not doctors think it's completely normal.
It's such a good point. I think, especially here in the US, where we have direct-to-consumer advertising, and so we're just constantly bombarded with drugs, with their names, with, the marketing pitches for what they do, with the long list of potential adverse effects that are given to you in this soporific voice. We're just so desensitized to how much power they have, to how potent these, especially in the context of psychiatric drugs, these are potent psychoactive chemicals coursing through our bloodstream basically all day, every day. And when you're on 3, 4, 5 of them at a time, like I eventually was, you can only do that if you've been completely desensitized to the significance of what these pills actually are. I think it's incredibly common here, as you said, both doctors and patients alike, to just forget. These aren't just inert, cute little colored objects. They're very potent synthetic chemicals.
Were you aware of feeling different yourself while you were on them?
It's such a tricky question to answer because I definitely felt like I was constantly changing for the worse, but I didn't really attribute it to the drugs. The one adverse effect that I really cared about was weight gain. And my weight did fluctuate 70 pounds anyways, so I didn't manage to avoid that. I had so internalized this idea of having this defective brain that I came to see all of my worsening problems as just symptoms of my illness. That message was reinforced by my well-meaning doctors who were all trying to help me. And because they weren't seeing the adverse effects themselves, I wasn't. We just kind of continued on in this way where with each passing year that I got more and more dysfunctional and disabled.
And of course, it's not just you who become convinced by this, it's also your family and friends. No one is thinking, hang on, is there something else going on? Everyone is thinking, Laura's seriously mentally ill. Thank goodness she's got these drugs to help her.
Exactly. If she wasn't on these drugs, imagine how much worse it would be. And it was already bad enough as it was. I was eventually getting hospitalized, and my suicidal feelings eventually grew so powerful and overwhelming that I actually tried to kill myself. I mean, we really were thinking, if it's this bad on meds, imagine how much worse it would be if she wasn't on her meds.
As you say, you end up going as an inpatient into hospital, and then you've got new drugs added to the mix. But that certainly doesn't make you feel any better.
No, as someone who reached a point where I loved going inpatient because it felt like the only place where I could be safe from myself. In retrospect, each of my inpatient experiences were quite underwhelming and disappointing, both because I was just essentially warehoused and separated from real life for a period of time and then put right back in the same life that felt so meaningless, but also because most of what was focused on what was, tweaking meds. Because I had been at this for many years by that point, I didn't have much faith in that because it hadn't helped me thus far. So why would it help me now? But that was what most of the focus seemed to be on. Like, let's assess her med list and see how we can improve things. Each time I left, I basically kind of slipped for the most part, slipped back into my dysfunctional groove of hopelessness and despair. And the meds never helped, really. In retrospect, it just didn't ever once occur to me to take that more seriously. I just took it for granted because of how sick I thought I was.
And ironically, during this time, you take a job as an unpaid research assistant in hospital, finding potential candidates for a study on first episode psychosis.
Yes.
If this was a movie, that scene would be unbelievable. But that doesn't last long.
No, it doesn't. And oh, God bless those psychiatrists I was working with on this study because they were very patient with me. That was such a surreal experience to have been an inpatient myself, and now here I was being given an ID badge that would swipe me on another locked unit. And I would just walk in there and walk into the nurse's station, and all the patients on the unit would look to me like I was some professional, and I felt like such a fraud. I also ended up seeing the inside of how an inpatient unit is operated, and I would sit on morning rounds. I'd sit in and listen to all the doctors talk about the patients, which was quite disturbing in and of itself. And, to watch them discuss which patients might be good for a particular drug trial that they were doing on the unit, which patient maybe needed electroshock. There I was sitting there listening to all of this, and none of these doctors had any idea that I myself had been at a nearby hospital myself, not too long prior. So suffice to say, I couldn't last very long in that job because I was so convinced that I was so sick that couldn't really be relied upon for anything. So I didn't make it very long. But they couldn't really fire me because I wasn't getting paid. So I just disappeared eventually.
So by now, Laura, you've taken a large number of different drugs. But rather than saying the treatment isn't working, instead you're told you've got treatment-resistant disease.
That message was so devastating to me, to basically, to have spent all of these previous years so devoted to treatment, such a good patient, doing what my doctors told me, diligently coming to therapy, doing outpatient programs, going inpatient when I needed it. I had put all my faith in this treatment because I was convinced that with this, disease in my brain, it was the only thing that could help me. And now here I was being told that I was just so defective that even the treatment couldn't help me. It was that story that eventually led me to conclude that killing myself was the only logical option, because if the only hope I had was treatment and treatment wasn't helping me, what was the point in living? And so that story of treatment-resistant mental illness, so to speak, was very much what led me to choose to end my life.
Pushed you over the edge.
Indeed. Yeah.
And this happens when you're actually living at home and you decide to go out for a walk on the cliff tops, taking an overdose. Can you explain what happened next?
So my family was all together for a holiday, and I'd left a couple of hours before sunset because I knew, it would be harder to find me if it was dark.
Wow, it's quite calculated.
It was very well thought through. And as someone who had been suicidal for years, up until that point, had always wanted to talk about my suicidal feelings because I didn't actually want to act on them. And so I would talk about it in therapy. I would talk about it with my family. But now at this point on this holiday, really wanted to end my life. So no one had any idea. I was very calculated in the whole thing, whether it was God, the universe, or some higher power of some kind. I'm not sure what, but I go into details about it in my book. But between my mother and my father, something went off in them instinctually that basically led them to find me with odds that were very small that they would have found me. And and they saved my life. And after I woke up from the coma, I was so angry. Because I really at that point did not want to be alive anymore. It had not been a cry for help. It was this very serious decision I'd made. And my father, he and I have talked about it over the years. He actually, for a moment, after he saw how angry I was, wondered if he'd made a mistake in saving me. I mean, imagine that a parent who loves his child so much would actually wonder, did I make a mistake in saving my child's life? I mean, it speaks to how much this story of incurable mental illness robbed me of any desire to be alive.
So there was always a hope before that you might get better, but hearing treatment-resistant illness extinguished your last hope.
Exactly. And to this day, I say this often, and it may sound controversial, but I, to this day, have respect for that choice I made, because given that story, killing myself was a logical choice to make. I'm very glad that it didn't work, of course. And of course, the problem was that was a false story of self. But I have a lot of respect for that choice I made. It made sense given this completely false story I had been taught to believe about myself.
And of course, when you come round, you've taken this cocktail of drugs and you're abruptly taken off all your meds, which of course causes problems, and you're suffering from heart abnormalities and liver problems, and now a new drug's added to the mix, lithium.
Yes, good old lithium. And that experience of being in the medical hospital and then on the inpatient psychiatric unit after my overdose, the hell was just unspeakable in terms of the combination of the poisoning of the overdose with the cold turkey withdrawal that I then endured for a few weeks. It was the worst. Those were the worst days, I think, of my whole life in terms of the pain and how ill I was, physically ill and all of that. And when I was eventually cleared to start a new regimen, lithium was presented to me as basically my last hope.
Did they want you to commit suicide again by telling you it was your last hope if it doesn't work?
See, I mean, it might, yeah, it's essentially what they were saying. But it was really sold to me in a very forceful way. And I remember being concerned about weight gain. I remember just knowing that I'd have to get regular blood tests because it has all these potential risks, but agreeing because, if they were right and this was my only chance, I had to give it a shot. There was so much, of course, that they hadn't told me about lithium. And I ended up, writing a whole chapter in my book about the drug and its history, because I think to this day, our culture puts it on this pedestal as this almost mythical medicine that, has been around for so long, tried and true treatment for bipolar. When you actually look at its history, you're just shocked at how shoddy the evidence base is and how dangerous of a drug it really is to the body.
The safety profile of lithium is not good. And actually, you go on to develop Hashimoto's disease. One of the side effects of lithium is that it can cause thyroid problems. Hashimoto's disease is autoimmune disease caused by thyroid problems.
Indeed. And I was also told not long after getting that Hashimoto's diagnosis that I should actually be grateful that it's Hashimoto's, because out of all the autoimmune conditions I could have, this is the easiest to manage.
So it could have been a worse side effect.
Exactly. And I actually recall feeling a bit embarrassed that I was so upset by this. Maybe I shouldn't be so upset. It isn't a big deal. And so, yeah, there I was, just put on Synthroid. And my thyroid had stopped functioning very rapidly, after starting lithium. So it could have easily been probably reversed if I had just stopped the lithium. But of course, that wasn't going to be considered because this was my last real chance.
Reading your book, I wonder if there was one earlier missed opportunity, because for the first time, you see a psychiatrist, Dr. Letwin, who doesn't prescribe meds. And I'll just quote what he says when you got in contact with him later. He says, "Many depressions are given a medical name by psychiatrists, ascribing the problem to chemistry and neglecting the context." So did he raise any queries about the cocktail of drugs that he'd been prescribed over the years?
We did not really talk about the meds at all because his colleague, whom he referred me to, handled that. I don't remember him, he certainly didn't give the meds significant power. He wasn't saying, "Are you taking your meds? They're going to save your life." I just don't recall us talking about them at all. The operating assumption was I came to him for therapy, and then whatever happened with the meds was over there.
Because actually what he says would be something that you would agree with.
You mean what you quoted him?
Yeah.
Yes. In retrospect, my goodness, he was a wise old soul. And I just wasn't ready to hear that message. I found messages like that offensive to me at the time because I was so invested in this idea that my brain was defective, that to talk about my life. What, do you not get that I have a serious brain disease? What do my life stressors have to do with that? Oh, great. Have some better relationships. Do you not understand? That was the headspace that I was in. And so I didn't end up seeing that psychiatrist for very long because I didn't take him seriously, specifically because he was asking, more meaningful questions. And, he also was aware of the socioeconomic background that I had and the culture of the town I grew up in and the expectations on girls and women. He, ironically, because of course I saw many women doctors over the years, he was the one who actually politicized my struggles and talked about how our society isn't so easy on girls and women all the time. I just wasn't ready to hear it then. So I stopped seeing him.
Because it almost felt as if he was minimizing it.
Exactly. Now looking back, in retrospect, see that this yearning I felt to have my pain validated, the best way to have validated my pain was to recognize it in the context of my life. But I had been so medicalized in how I thought about myself that to me, the only way that pain was legitimate was if you saw it through a medical lens.
So by this stage, your diagnosis of bipolar disorder, major depression, social anxiety disorder, eating disorder, NOS, binge eating disorder, substance use disorder, borderline personality disorder, an obsessive compulsive disorder. I mean, that's quite the list.
Indeed, I should win some kind of award for. And of course, it never once occurred to me to step back and say, is this like how scientific is this here? Because they're just tacking on these diagnoses here, over here, and a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and we'll take this one away. It never occurred to me to step back and question any of this. To me, the more diagnoses, the better, because it meant that my pain was being recognized. I truly thought the more, the better.
And it showed the severity.
Yeah, exactly.
Just letting listeners know the drugs that you've been prescribed since you were 13. Antipsychotics, Seroquel, Geodin, Zyprexa, Risperdal, Amplify, mood stabilizers, Depakote, Topamass, Lamictal, lithium, anti-narcoleptic, Propofol, an insomnia drug, Ambien, substance abuse drugs, anti-abuse, naltrexone, antidepressants, Prozac, Efessor, Celexa, Cymbalda, Wellbutrin, Lexapro. I mean, I'll make that 19 drugs in total.
And I think I probably was on more I never even got my records for. But yes, that is the list that I can verify with records.
And interestingly, on your next inpatient visit, you meet a woman, Eve, and it seems that friendship actually helps you a lot.
Meeting Eve was such a turning point for me. She was a fellow Harvard student, although she ended up never finishing. She was a fellow accomplished athlete from a family of socioeconomic means like mine. We'd had this very similar upbringing where we'd had a lot of expectations on our shoulders. We'd been driven, overachieving girls, and found ourselves at Harvard and completely spun out. She'd had some hard things happen to her in high school and had begun drinking as a means of coping. Among other struggles she'd also struggled with eating issues and all kinds of self-injury, all kinds of things. And when we met on that unit, there was just this overpowering chemistry between us, of friendship, of sisterhood, really. And I had been so lonely for so long, and it had been so long that I'd had a meaningful friendship with anyone, really. And we became fast friends and spent all of our time together on the unit. And when we were discharged, spent basically every day together. We were in the same outpatient program. She was in AA. She's the one who really introduced me to AA because I had quit drinking around that time, because drinking had become my go-to source of relief from my treatment-resistant mental illness. And so it had obviously become a bit of a problem because I was drinking heavily on 4 or 5 different psychiatric drugs. So I really was having some serious problems. She helped me connect, really. She was my bridge back into life. And I think introduced me to the world of the 12 steps, which at that time played an absolutely instrumental role for me in helping me connect with how important it is to get out of yourself and be of service, to kind of feel yourself a part of something bigger than you. You know, all of these deeper spiritual pursuits that I had never encountered in my life. So Eve, to this day, you know, I hold a soft spot in my heart for her, for all that she introduced to me. In the book, you know, I go into what happens in our relationship, which eventually ended. But I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't crossed paths with her, to be perfectly honest. Yeah, it's hard to know if I would have found my way to AA in the way that I had, which then led me towards the rest of the journey.
Because, of course, what happens to anyone in your situation, your relationships are decimated.
Yep.
Your life is so fractured that all disappears. So you become incredibly isolated.
Yep. And you become, for me at least, this isn't the case for everyone, but for me, I also became incredibly self-absorbed and self-obsessed and just turned inward because I grew up in therapy basically every single week. The exception of those years that I escaped to boarding school, I grew up in weekly therapy where I sat down in front of very well-meaning, mostly kind-hearted mental health professionals who just subtly and insidiously kind of taught me to obsess over myself and my emotions and my thoughts and the day-to-day of my life. I don't think all therapy is like this, and there are all kinds of modalities that help you get out of yourself. But my experience of therapy had turned me into a very self-absorbed person. And so that also made relationships hard because I didn't have time to focus on someone else. Like I have my brain disease to focus on, it's just like it disincentivized me from having relationships with anyone besides people paid to be there with me, really.
I'm sure this is a sweeping statement, but I have often felt you can spot people who've had a lot of therapy from the way they talk. Because normal relationships are give and take. It's a two-way process. And there's a sort of unintentional narcissism that often, I think, is there. Understandably, because when you go to therapy, it is a one-way relationship. It's not supposed to be a two-way relationship in the way that a friendship or any other relationship is.
It's a really insightful point. And as you said, I'm sure there are exceptions to that, but I do think that is a pattern I too have seen. It's tragic because I was yearning for connection. I was yearning for relationship. And I think because I was sent to therapy as a kid, I never really had a chance to learn how to forge meaningful, give and take, authentic human relationships. I thought that's what connection was sitting down with someone paid to be there, paid to listen to you talk about yourself, and then help, validate you at the end, remind you it's not your fault, you're not a bad person, you're sick. Of course, they're not incentivized to make you not need them anymore. So you keep coming back. I think about how many young people grow up in therapy, and I can't help but wonder if there's a significant percentage of them that have had a similar experience as I had.
And I do think there's also a transatlantic difference here, because of course there's many people in the UK who are on multiple psychiatric medications, but certainly the use in children don't see at the same level here.
I'm glad to hear that. I hope it's not trending upwards, because here the numbers are shocking. 2022 numbers from the CDC, so who knows where they're at now, but I think it's 1 in 10 if you count from ages 2 to 17. But between 12 and 17, it's a significantly higher percentage. And I think about all the friendships that aren't made, all the opportunities to be of service, to get out of yourself, to be there for someone else that aren't had in young people here. And it hurts my heart because that was my way out, was learning how to get out of myself. Really, in many ways, like that's the core shift that happened for me that helped me get out. So many young kids aren't getting that chance now because of all the well-meaning adults around them, training them to focus on themselves.
I was interested to read that you actually said that AA was more help to you than the psychiatric treatment. Why?
I think what AA helped me connect with was how powerful it is to hear the stories of other people who've been through the pain you've been through and come out on the other side. It was a revelation to me to hear people with, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years of sobriety stand up at the podium and they're just beaming vitality. And they're talking about these profoundly dark nights of the soul. And yet there they are, they're through it. And it's not like they're not struggling in their lives, but, just seeing them up there and how strong and rooted in themselves, how much peace of mind they had, even with the struggles of life. I'd never had that experience of hearing myself in the story of someone else and then seeing that person further down this path that I was realizing I was on. AA showed me there's a path through your pain. And that path is largely about the steps, of course, instill in you this idea of surrendering to powers that are greater than you, to owning your mistakes, seeing where fear is driving you in your life. There are all these deeper lessons that I learned in AA that I still carry with me to this day, even though it's been a long time since I've been in AA. But I think probably the most important thing that AA taught me was that the pain I'd been through might help someone else. It had been pain that I had seen as symptoms of this illness for so many years. Just my years were wasted. My symptoms were these meaningless byproducts of my brain pathology. And now I was realizing, wait a minute, the struggles I've been through, I might be able to use them to help someone else who's in their own struggle. That was just everything. That shifted everything for me. And AA taught me that.
So you're already starting to think differently, but your epiphany really arrives the day you walk into a bookshop and you see a copy of Anatomy of an Epidemic by Robert Whittaker. And his thesis is really that the increasing number of people suffering from psychiatric problems may be as a result of medication.
This book was my aha moment. I couldn't even read too much of it at first. I was on 5 meds at that point, and so reading was hard, but just because of how painful this thesis was.
So being on 5 meds makes it difficult for you just to read?
Oh my goodness, yes. I wasn't attributing it to the meds, of course. I was attributing it to my illness. But yes, concentrating, absorbing words, memory, just comprehension. I would just read a paragraph. I'd get to the end of a paragraph and I'd come to and I'd realize, did I just read something? And then I'd have to start it over and start it over. I was so cognitively impaired by all these drugs, not realizing it was the drugs.
Which would make you basically unemployable.
And which I most certainly was. I tried working, couldn't handle it because of the family I was born into. I could come home and they would take care of me, or they'd cover my rent and food expenses until I could find another job. I'm aware that I managed to not have to work because of the family I was born into. And I'm very grateful that I had that insulation. But yes, holding down a full-time job on 5 psych meds would never have been possible. And so when I found this book, and its cover is what called me in, this old phrenology head, each compartment was a different drug name. And I'd been on most of the drugs on this cover and bought it. As I absorbed the thesis that he was presenting, the treatment is making us collectively sicker. That was what woke me up, really. I look back on the previous decade, which was the decade that I'd been this compliant patient, doing exactly what my doctor said, and 2 meds became 3, became 4, became 5. And with each passing year, my life had fallen more and more apart. And I tried to kill myself and I couldn't work and I was physically ill and had no friends and couldn't stay in romantic relationships. And the list goes on. And all along thinking it had been me and this treatment-resistant mental illness, an Anatomy of an Epidemic clicked for me, this realization, what if it's the treatment?
So you decide that you want to come off the drugs?
Yep. I knew I had to. I knew if my life didn't have just treatment-resistant mental illness and suicide and psych wards, if there was another option, I had to see what that might be. And I could always kill myself, was how I thought at the time. I can always end it if I try it out and it doesn't go well. It was curiosity more than anything that I think drove me to come off everything. And I had no idea at the time. This was back in 2010. I was 27. I had no idea that my brain had become so dependent on all these drugs and that tapering slowly, hyperbolically was really important. I knew none of this.
And it has to be said, neither did the psychiatrists.
Indeed. My psychopharmacologist, who was not supportive of me coming off really any of it anyways, but eventually agreed, and he had his whole little logic for why he was able to agree. I go into it in the book. He clearly had no idea what he was doing either, because I came off 5 drugs in around half a year, which is basically cold turkey. I thought half a year was very, very slow and had no idea how backwards I had it.
And that's been a problem, Laura, hasn't it? For a long, long time, people have thought, or psychiatrists have told patients either that you could just stop straight away or you could just withdraw over a few weeks. But Dr. Mark Horowitz, who I mentioned at the start of the podcast, has shown through his work and also some other people that actually some of these tapers have to take years.
Yep. For some people, it takes years because of how little we understand the effects of these drugs on us. It's mysterious who might be able to come off a little bit faster, who does need years and years. There's no way to know up front, which is why approaching any taper through a harm reduction framework and just assuming that you're one of the ones who needs a longer time is the safest way to go about it. Maybe you can eventually go a little bit faster, but if you start too fast and you destabilize yourself, I mean, I have friends who've been disabled for months, if not years, from coming off abruptly, not realizing that they were going too fast. The insidious thing about it is there's so little public awareness about this. When people come off their meds, in ways that they think are slow, like a few weeks or a few months, and all hell breaks loose, they're told, oh, you're having a relapse of your illness. This is why you need your meds. You don't want to feel this way. Like, this is your baseline, how you feel right now. And so people conclude, oh my gosh, I hate how I feel when I don't take my meds. Like, that's proof that I need these meds, not realizing like, no, actually this is withdrawal. And if you go back on and then restabilize and then try again more slowly, it might look very different. So many people don't get that message and then end up staying on these meds for decades.
How long would you say from coming off drugs to coming to whatever new normality you felt you got to took in terms of years?
And that's a question that my answer has changed over the years, because the longer it's been, the more I realize, holy moly, I'm still healing. I would say 3 years was really when I felt like I had kind of reintegrated and was fully living. That being said, prior to that, I was coming online and engaged in a lot of meaningful work and friendships and all of that. But year 3 was a big turning point where it felt like my body had recovered enough of a post-drug homeostasis, whatever that even means. I was like fully living. The first year off was brutal. From year 2, just got steadily less bad. And year 3 was really when I felt like I was living. But to this day, I still have sensitivities that I sometimes wonder, would I have had them if I had never taken psych drugs? Maybe not, to food and to fragrances and to chemicals generally. The way I see it, if this is my lasting problem, like, great, because it just forces me to listen to my body and to take good care of myself. But everyone's timeline is different. Some people heal really quickly and others really slowly, but people heal. That's, I think, the most important message is people do heal.
Laura, obviously you came from a well-off family, and I imagine insurance plans would have paid for some, but probably not all of your treatment. So I wondered if you'd ever totted up the full total of the amount your parents spent over the years.
I've thought about doing that. I haven't. If you include insurance, millions of dollars, I'm sure. If you don't include insurance, it's hard to say. I mean, most of my therapy was out of pocket. It was not covered, and that was a lot. But most of my hospitalizations were covered by insurance. Most of my outpatient programs were covered by insurance, but millions if you include what was covered by insurance. I made a lot of people a lot of money as a psychiatric patient. That's for sure.
Do you think you'd have been in a better or worse position if your parents had had less money? I mean, presumably you would have ended up in grimmer hospitals, but would you have had perhaps less medical intervention early on?
It's such a good question. I mean, I can only hypothesize, but sometimes I wonder if my parents had less resources, would I have gotten into the depths of the mess that I got into? I probably wouldn't have. That being said, I was really struggling and I needed help. And so I don't know if not getting put on meds would have been enough for me to have figured out my struggles. Like, I don't know how things would have gone. They could have gone very badly in a different kind of way if I hadn't gotten sucked into the kind of medical model of psychiatry. I often think, and I often say, that it was my socioeconomic means that got me so far in, because we trusted the best of the best that we were seeing. But it was also my resources that got me out.
So, Laura, what do you think should have happened when you were showing signs that you were clearly a very distressed teenager?
The best answer I can come up with is had I been in an environment where other young people were visibly talking about their struggles without medicalizing them. So had I seen that my experience was actually far from unique, far from special, far from abnormal, that might have helped me find the courage to open up, to connect with other young people, maybe to find an older young person who could mentor me through it, kind of similar to AA and this whole idea I was talking about earlier of seeing yourself in someone else's story. That's the best hypothetical solution I can give. But, that wasn't possible back then. And any discussion that, we see today around talking openly about your struggles, I mean, for the most part, is fueled by these industry-funded anti-stigma campaigns that are teaching young people, yes, there's no shame in struggling. But really what they're saying is there's no shame in getting a diagnosis and treatment. And so I think until we separate the medical propaganda, really, that's encouraging young people to get a diagnosis and to get treatment from this deeper, noble pursuit of no one should feel ashamed to talk about struggles. People should feel like they can. They just don't need to take it that next step where they medicalize them and treat them with pills. Until we separate those from each other, the solution that I think would have helped me back then just doesn't feel very viable.
Or just accepting that it's part of the human struggle. I'm just reminded I had a neurologist on the podcast recently, and she talked about a study that was done in the UK in 2 schools. One group of children in one school were given mental health awareness training, and the others weren't. And at the end of the study, the children given the mental health awareness had worse mental health. Neither of these groups were given any drugs or anything. These were otherwise healthy kids, but they were interpreting their experiences differently following this mental health awareness education.
That says everything. That is it right there. Does not surprise me. And what a tragedy that this noble pursuit of being open about struggles can get so perverted by medicalizing it and backfiring and making people struggle even more.
Now, you said there's no anti-medication or anti-psychiatry moral to your story, but I think if one reads your book, it's hard to see it as an endorsement of modern psychiatry. To be honest, it feels pretty critical to me.
It's a very fair point you're raising. And I think the way that I would describe it is that I, for myself personally, can say quite definitively that turning to diagnoses and pills is not right for me or my children, my family. But beyond that, who am I to say what anyone else needs or doesn't need? I truly, having grown up in these power dynamics of mental health professionals kind of telling me what I need and what I don't need, I'm very sensitized to that kind of power. And I truly believe that I have no idea what someone else needs or doesn't need. They do. But they can only make that determination for themselves if they're given good information. And also if they're presented with a wide variety of options. Because informed choice is impossible without information or options. And so my book is an attempt to convey information that I eventually learned for myself that I hadn't been given and my parents hadn't been given at the start of my journey. Information that probably would have led us to not go down the path that we went down on because we didn't have the information. So I am putting it out there. And I'm also putting out there, what did end up eventually helping me instead of a diagnosis, instead of pills, instead of a paid professional. But what people choose to do with that information, I truly believe is up to them. And I do think there are people for whom these drugs can feel really helpful, especially in the short term, as long as they understand that these are not medicines that are treating a pathology, as long as they understand the kind of lack of scientific processes by which these diagnoses come into being, and they understand the infosphere, you could say, that we all learn about these things. Like if they know all of this, and to them the risks of the drugs are worth it, all the power to them. I get why people have a hard time seeing why I say that I'm not anti-med or why my book is not anti-med. I find it interesting that when I put facts out there, the fact that a drug trial is about 6 to 8 weeks on average, yet most people go on to take them long term. People hear that as me being critical of psychiatry. And I'm like, well, this is just a fact. It's not my opinion. I'm just giving you a fact. If you think that fact is critical, that's worth reflecting on. What does it have to do with me? I'm just putting a fact out there. So sometimes people, I think, conflate facts and information with me having an agenda of some kind. My only agenda is putting the information out there. What people choose to do with it is up to them.
So finally, Laura, how would you describe your mental health today?
Well, I don't really think of myself in that way anymore in terms of health or mental health. Those words don't really resonate with me today. But what I would say is I still feel tons of emotional pain. I'm a very angsty person by nature. I'm primed to distrust my surroundings. Say I'm a bit paranoid sometimes. I can be quick to anger, especially if I'm not getting good sleep, taking care of myself. I can feel really insecure. I feel plenty of emotional pain. I cry a lot, usually from grief or anger. The main difference is that I'm not afraid of any of it, and I don't see any of it as a sign of anything wrong with me. I see it all as a sign that I'm alive and I'm connected to the world around me, and I'm sensitive and in touch with what's happening around me. And so I feel vital, and my life has meaning and purpose, and I'm connected to good friends and colleagues, to my work, to being of service. So life is painful and beautiful at the same time. And really, that's been a big lesson for me, is realizing that being here is not about being happy at all. Like, I don't need to be happy all the time. I don't want to be happy all the time. I want to feel like I have a sense of belonging. I want to feel like I have a purpose.
But don't those things lead to each other?
Exactly.
Having a belonging and sense of purpose is also, after all, likely to make you feel happier.
Exactly. Happiness is the byproduct. It's not the thing you pursue. It comes as the byproduct of these deeper pursuits. It's so funny how often I have to kind of counter people's assumptions that I'm great now. You're mentally healthy and happily ever after. And I'm often like, well, no, actually, if I sat down in front of a psychiatrist and laid it all out for him, he would definitely have a few diagnoses that he could, throw at me. But that doesn't mean anything to me. It's psychobabble to me at this point. I'm like, so who cares what they would say? My book, I've had a lot of psychiatrists out there on the internet analyzing what diagnoses I actually really do have from reading my book, which I find hilarious. Oh, yeah, I don't take it seriously.
Well, Laura, thank you so much for talking today. And I'm so pleased you made the recovery you did.
Oh, Liz, it's an honor being on your podcast, and I've had such a nice time chatting with you, so thank you. Bye.
Goodbye. Hope you enjoyed the latest episode of the podcast. And if you've enjoyed the podcast, if you could share it and leave a review on Spotify and Apple, I'd much appreciate it. It really helps. Many thanks for listening. Bye for now.